Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Looking forward to Major Taylor Wilson, also known as Growl. That's his call sign. He's going to be presenting today on the U.S. Air Force's COOL, the Center Ops On-Line, and their project there with 18F, which should be very interesting to hear as far as how they got to DevOps. We're going to wait just another couple minutes, though. Many folks can run meetings right up to the top of the hour, so it's always good to give folks an opportunity to shift gears and jump on this particular call. So thanks for your patience. We'll get going in just another minute or two. All, thanks so much for joining. We're going to get going in just another minute, giving other folks an opportunity to join. Thanks for your patience. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brian Fox with 18F. Thanks so much for joining. Sure is great to have everyone joining the call. Folks are continuing to jump on here today. Looking forward to today's particular event. This is going to be really terrific to hear from Major Wilson, Taylor Wilson, formerly with the Center Ops On-Line. He's actually in the midst of a PCS, or a permanent change of station, so he's in the midst of moving. So this is especially probably logistically difficult. So I appreciate you, sir, coming in and taking the time to share with us. It's very good of you to do that. Just some of the logistics from my end, just a reminder that this particular meeting is being recorded. This is great because it allows you to share the content with colleagues, you know, after the video is posted. We share those links out and remind folks of the content that's online, available on YouTube after the fact, on the listserv, as well as on the Slack channels. We are using, we're back to using Zoom, which is great. It's been a good tool for us in the past. Just a heads up, if there are any bad actors, this Zoom bombing, it hasn't happened to us, but we've heard about it in the news and everything else, and we just have a low-lying kind of concern about it. So if you notice any bad actors, let us know so we can remove them. And if it becomes a continuous issue that can't be resolved, we'll go ahead and quit the call, and then we'll go just record this content separately and kick it out to you all via the listserv and those usual channels. Just as far as some upcoming presentations. So yep, today is Major Wilson presenting. Next month though, in July, we're gonna have Thomas Hollowell from the U.S. Customs and Immigration Service. In August, we're having a special presenter come in, Andrew Schaefer, kind of one of the fathers of DevOps. I met him at a conference back in January or February, and he's willing to come in and share some of his thoughts on transformation, digital transformation. So we're going to have him on the 4th of August, but on our usual schedule, later in August, we're going to have Stephen Benner from NOAA, and then Sarah Allen is coming in September, and then Raven Manuel with the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture is going to be coming in October, and I'm especially interested in her presentation. If you haven't heard much about that organization. It's a new organization, and her challenges are particularly interesting because there's no legacy. And not having IT legacy in government is an interesting place to be. So she's going to be sharing her story in October. So all sorts of fun stuff up and coming. Just a reminder about what we're about. We're all about sharing what's happening with DevOps across all of government. And this can be the technical as well as the management lessons learned, the successes, as well as, you know, the failures that you've learned from in the organization. Feel free to put any questions you'd have for our presenter today in the chat. I'll be using that after the presentation to facilitate the Q&A. And don't forget, there's an opportunity for discussions beyond the event in the listservs, as well as those Slack channels. So great ways to do that. And again, the video will be posted afterward. We'll go ahead and share where the web presence is, digital.gov/communities/DevOps. And last but not least, always a request for presentations. If you or your organization has something to share with the rest of the community across government, let us know. We are currently planned out through May of 2021, but we will get you in there. Other folks want to hear what's going on, so please do that. Otherwise, Alex, anything else from you, sir?
No, that's it. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, as a reminder, if you have any questions, put them into the chat. Brian will facilitate the Q&A with Growl. And yeah, this event is being recorded. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all. Otherwise, Growl, looking forward to it today. It's over to you. Thanks.
All right, Brian, Alex, thanks, and thanks everybody for showing up. As Brian was mentioning, you know, I've listened into several of these, and this may be slightly less technical than you're used to, but hopefully you guys get something out of it. And what I'm going to be talking about is our Center Ops On-Line, or what we called COOL, is our Air Force flight operations software, and our growth, demise, and then kind of building up towards new success, all based around the partnership that we had with 18F, working through their experiment and iterate phase, where we actually put our nose to the grind. And as I see through the participants here, we even got one of our noble developers that worked with us, Clint Troxel. So thanks very much for being here. So he will be able to field all the technical questions that you guys have. And I'm here as your former program manager, and or what I came to learn as more of a product owner for that Center Ops On-Line software that basically runs the entire Air Force Materiel Command's flight operations. We'll talk about our Agile, or maybe fake Agile, and some of our DevOps lessons learned, focusing more on the, you know, the organizational, managerial, and product development and deployment lessons learned. All right, so as a quick background, we'll talk about what we are, our quote unquote Agile that we had been living with for about 10 years and even beyond. Our crippling org structure that is kind of inherent in a lot of things military, and then our you know, look into the problem with our path analysis executed along with 18F, as well as our experiment and iterate phase that we moved in a slightly new direction with our software development model, as well as the product itself. Talk about some lessons learned, and I'll field any softballs that you have. So essentially, where did we begin? We began on this, you know, road towards innovation and changing our framework and mindset of what our software development was, by myself and several other colleagues attending an AFWorks and 18F workshop in Las Vegas. And I even see Miss Seifert, who's in the crowd audience right now. She gave a stellar talk along with her colleagues, talking about, you know, human-centered design and UI UX, smart practices, open source development, which is really feeding the fight for this Agile stuff, and recognizing how to implement Agile in a smart way, especially given all the constraints. We kind of funneled all around the same problem of our scheduling system sucks in the military. People are our most valuable asset, and however we don't treat them as such. And therefore, that was our pivot point to recognize a problem and start working towards a solution in the mass group of people that congregated there at the AFWorks convention, trying to solve the problem from many different angles from many different organizations. So that's what we're going to be briefly talking about today, and I'll go into it here in a second. So starting off, AFMC is the Materiel Command, or basically the home of all things test and operations for the Air Force. Center Ops On-Line grew out of the F-22 aircraft in that they needed a way to track all of the missions, the people, the training, the currencies, and all of their paperwork and documentation so that they were safe, ready, and good to fly. This was a web-based platform that ultimately grew to what it is now of being owned by the higher Air Force level at the MAJCOM command, or the highest command prior to kind of the Secretary of Defense's there. It's a web-based platform, which is a little bit different than most either proprietary or contracted services that provide this. But it was initially run by a mediocre team of 10 to maybe 15 total developers across several years of initial development, and then started winding itself back into a sustainment mode where it has been living for about the past 10 years until about 2018, where this kind of picks up with our partnership with 18F. Services 20 bases, 50,000 units, and honestly, it's probably one of the biggest bangs for the buck in terms of what we pay, in terms of Air Force Materiel Command pays for this management software and what it provides to all the different diverse users, whether they're operating on very, very small airfields, flying very niche aircraft, to testing the largest test fleet out at Edwards Air Force Base or Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. So essentially what this had grown into was this gigantic monster that is being farmed out continually from base to base. However, the software continually was falling behind, running with basically no program manager or product owner, no voice to the user directly. We had one government lead developer and 4 contractors who were basically sharing the load across the help desk, as well as providing new updates, new patches for security, etc. And what this turned into was, an unacceptable interface, challenging interoperability, and features for people who were using the system where this was not their primary job or goal. This was like a means to an end to fill out the requirements and to document their work, maybe on a given flight, mission, training event, etc. What we assessed was, maybe 5 to 10 years time, with the flight operations landscape greatly changing, moving from platforms to systems to, families of systems, micro UAVs, launching hundreds of these things with minuscule flight times. It was basically going to be impossible to keep up with where we were going, and ultimately not support the test missions. And so that's essentially where we were realizing, after 10 years of software, it's time to refresh, and here's where we are. So to give you a quick look, I'll just give you a demo of the homepage. I can't show a whole lot more just due to some FOUO limitations. However, this was pretty much the starting point as I walked in to the unit. So this is our main landing page. It becomes insanely cumbersome to use, especially when this is kind of your, you have 10 minutes, 15 minutes prior to the flight, and you need to execute all of your testing, document your risk management scores for the flight, and step out to fly. And you're dealt with this somewhat unwieldy system that is overloading you with information. One of the funniest things that 18F in their path analysis brought up to us is they said, this is good and great and all, but it's probably not a great sign to prominently display the help desk contact in the largest font, basically screaming to the users, we don't know how to use this either. Please just call us and we'll massage the data on the back end, because it's so hard to give you guys a continuously correct answer. So this is kind of what we were looking at. And then as you start diving into the drop-down menus, you'll recognize that there's just so many different links that go to separate pages, and there's not really a single view or single filterable layout that is intuitive and easy to use. Again, we're trying to like throw the spaghetti at the wall and hope that our users are trained enough to use it well. And obviously with the high turnover that we have in the military and our users that are continually stretched thin, we can't always assume that for our products that we deliver. In the military, as you guys have probably seen several articles float around, we have an abundance of what we call fake Agile. We're starting to see some of the challenges with even some of our platforms and systems move into an Agile contracting vehicle in the military, in test and evaluation, and ultimately, if you have that wrong scheme model, it is very detrimental to producing valuable software at the end of the day. When we didn't have that program manager or that product owner in place to really connect to the user needs, then we're missing out on those user stories and that user connection of recognizing what they really want, even though they may be saying something on paper. Taking a look at kind of the timeline of charts, this is not Agile. However, we treated it as such, in that we had a limited input at one annual conference where people threw their complaints out to us like rotten tomatoes up on the stage, at which point we built ourselves as the developers a prioritized list and started tackling those one by one. While yes, there was a regular release schedule, that wasn't really Agile. And because there was no clear vision or direction, we were missing out on that critical piece of and leaving the developers stranded high and dry, not recognizing the true impact of their work and not recognizing how they should be developing certain things for. So that's kind of the baseline of what we were dealing with. We thought we were Agile, I would argue, but without that critical user node, we were missing out on quite a bit of development there. As we look into our organization, we basically had what I call DevOps chaos and office space. I have 8 bosses, Bob. As you look at myself, Growl in the middle of our developer team, which was about 4 to 5 contractor and government civilian developers who didn't quite know who to get their answers from. We had money sources pooling in from different locations, and everybody and their mother contacting the help desk, which was siphoning away hours and hours of their pure development time, which was really, really challenging. Ultimately, what you have is the output of disparate features, and we were continuously in patch or fix mode without stepping back, recognizing how can we attack the problem from a different angle and provide the users with a more complete solution. So this was basically realized in and around the 2017 to early 2018 timeline, where we were continuing to advocate to the highest levels in our chains of command that we needed, long-term program management, we needed long-term funding streams, and it just wasn't happening. That isn't to say that we weren't trying to do things on our own. We just didn't have the dedicated time and available people to put at it. As basically the beginning of 2018 and moving into the summer of 2018 is when we really reached out and started working very closely with the 18F. Now, the government itself and the military, we had our own, if you will call it, innovation team, in that we tried to instill some of the principles from Sun Tzu in The Art of War of knowing thyself, trying to dig into our own problems, step back and try and relate with the user base, which was super important, try and give people some confidence that we recognize their pain and we were working on something. However, we had a challenging decision. Do we completely scrap what we have in that software? Do we go with a contracted known quantity solution, whether it be any and all open source or closed source proprietary stuff? Or do we start over in the early times of 2000, try and throw a good bit of money at it, and then start over? And ultimately, the path analysis really helped us out with that, in that they highlighted some key issues with the lack of user-centered design, as I've talked about, with no UI UX designer. That was kind of a keynote that none of us as the core developers recognized as a major need. And then without having that full-time PM or product owner even in place, there was no user feedback. So even though we would roll out something off of the developer table, coded it up, everything seems like it's running well, we still didn't recognize that we made the right thing, not just a thing. That cross-functional capabilities were missing. Obviously, the lack of Agile maturity, in that our sprint timings, our ceremonies were a bit lackluster, and it was missing that forward vision of recognizing how do we continue to strangle off our old problems and move towards a new mature system. As we finished up that path analysis with 18F, our organization structure needed to change. Essentially what we tried to do is I took it upon myself to stand up as the product owner as kind of a part-time role, as I was still flying and executing my test pilot mission on the side as well. I stood in front of the cool team and tried to take as many spears as I could, all the while continuing to advocate up to the higher chains of command that we needed talent, we needed experience, and we needed the right kind of leadership to support and back us with the long-term funding, which ultimately resulted in quite a bit of user teleconferences highlighting the same challenges that we had talked about previously, but recognizing that people were accepting of new ways of doing business, and that was super important. Ultimately, what we tried to square the corner was more standardized timelines for releases, as well as continuing to just provide valuable software, even though if it was only 80%, it was something that met the end user needs, which were not the higher headquarters or higher stakeholders needs in general from the business standpoint. Now, leading into the experiment and iterate phase, which was about started in 2019, that was executed for about 3 to 4 months. Quite a bit of telework happening and a lot of remote stuff. And this is where we really went to work to separate ourselves from the government networks, trying to move off network with our cloud DevOps environments, and then started to clarify some roles and responsibilities, which is where we made some of our biggest gains. We onboarded some full-time UI UX people and started basically transitioning people into the mindset of the government civilians who have kind of like long timelines with us. They were going to own the new development, while our contractors were going to handle the help desk side of things, with some cross flow throughout it, so that we continue to dedicate the time needed for the new development, while also continuing to keep on life support some of the older modules, as we executed a strangler approach to try and siphon off the old stuff and get new development out the door. For the actual experiment and iterate phase, we focused on modernizing that scheduling system, which if we remember back, that was the first key point of concern at that AFWorks convention. This is the biggest user pain point. We assessed it as the highest value. And essentially, we were leveraging our new UI UX government civilians, along with the help of Clint and his team at 18F. And we also focused on some new delivery pipeline, new code base. We were working with some old stuff. I couldn't tell you exactly what it was, but essentially it had been continuously patched over and over and over with very few comments in the source code. And we started basically over from scratch on very thin slices, which was really important, which allowed a quick turnover of our product, showing that to the users, and getting that continuous user feedback loop, which was super, super important. Here's a couple examples of kind of what you were looking at of the new stuff. Again, we were essentially taking our 2005, 2010, scheduling drop downs, which required 400 clicks to get anywhere. And we turned it into something that's more user-friendly, more recognizable, simple to use, similar to pretty much any airline website that you may go to, or even Google calendars sort of style look. We had a lot of challenges with connecting our networks with kind of the security models that we had to work with. However, focusing on the delivery pipeline was also a key thing to get our developers trained to ask the right questions, to put things into the right language, and to know when to ask for help on the outside. This continued agile development, obviously the path analysis and experiment and iterate phase kind of ended around, we'll say like mid to late 2019, following with a strangler approach to sunset some of the older legacy models. We were working towards replacing some of our more challenging aspects of the flight ops software with more user-centric apps, and trying to get the users away from using the #1 MWS or warfare system known to man, which is also known as Excel. And we're trying to get them to eliminate all those third-party workarounds, which are just causing more time and flail and challenge. So this is kind of a quick example of our touch screen enabled movable puckboard, which would allow a lot of users a quick glance into the future, allow schedulers to view one common sense of truth source, and it was all interconnected with our flight ops management tool. So again, this is kind of the other thing that we were working on the side, along with all the training and DevOps pipeline sort of stuff. And we'll move in. I know I'm running a little bit late on time, but run into some key lessons learned. Again, not your heavily technical side of things, but just from the product owner's standpoint, and ultimately the organization being king on this one. What we recognized was some of the high turnover or fluid positioning that is very inherent in military organizations. You need to be very, very careful in onboarding, whether it be the inside hires, the contract to government moves, or even the outsourcing to some of the partnerships that we had. 18F was a great connection in that there was a zero profit there on their side, and they were coming in with a willingness and readiness to learn our system and move us in the right direction. But that onboarding took a good amount of time with refining our goals of both of the organizations, making sure that we had our expectations set. And that was really, really important, which if I were to do it again, we'd probably spend a little bit more time on that, really get some clarity from our developers, from my program management side and the product owner and the users, and make sure that we're executing that to make the best use of the time and money. I'll say the continuous integration, continuous development, deployment, and some of those modern practices are not always appreciated when you go up to the higher levels of the organizations, and they just say, well, just produce me software and I'll just pay, $100,000 and I just want to see it work. That's not always the case, because everybody is often stuck in that waterfall style of delivery and deployment, where they expect the working product to work perfectly at the end of the day. Now, that isn't really the case. Nobody just gets handed an iPhone and it just works perfectly out the box every single time. First time, there is that kind of that growth required, that kind of learning process. And that was really, really important to be communicating up the chain so that there was no false sense of security when we're moving into a new venture. I'll say in terms of some of the security postures, the military has had a long history of basically holding too many things close to the chest and not recognizing and reaching out to the outside communities. Moving into the open source world was such a big pain until we finally got the right person on the phone with the right leverage and took a bit of courage on our end to just say, we're going there and we're going to start using off-the-shelf stuff because we are a public domain entity. Our material and data is sensitive. However, the tools that we use shouldn't be complex and cosmic and unattainable for our developers to enable fast, quick turnovers. Moving on to my final slide here with the key lessons learned from the program management and the product owner side. I was continuously bombarded with questions of, can we do this? Can we do that? And I always love to I'm a people pleaser in that I would say, yes, yeah, we can do that. I don't know how long it'll take, but you'll get it, XYZ, no matter what it was. And I remember my first meeting with 18F, they were like, stop doing that. Just say no and don't be afraid to put people in the tracks, to get people to recognize this is the vision. You need to get on board with the vision, and you can't water that down at all. And it may come down to basically telling the users, telling even your developers, no, that's not in line with where we're going, and therefore we're not going to prioritize that solution. You'll read a couple of these other ones. I won't go into too many detail, but releasing with fanfare, even if it's an 80% solution, was super valuable because basically when we were just working in our old models, we were delivering software maybe once every month, every other month, with sometimes valuable stuff. However, it went completely unnoticed to the user. And they were continually surprised when I would reach out and find that the problem had been already solved, 6 months ago, and a lot of users' revolt would be quelled very quickly. However, if you had that continuous, communication model set up, the feedback was, pipelines were open, then that kind of releasing with fanfare and continually getting the needs from the users, that's going to boil out to a much better prioritized list for the developers, so that they're not feeling that they're constantly under fire in the trenches, throwing grenades back, and that's where we have. And ultimately, I did a lot of polls, when I was taking over this job a couple of years ago, and trying to learn, like, what is Agile? And I remember querying a bunch of my coworkers in the test and evaluation world. I kept asking, like, what's Agile? And they were just like, well, it's just iterating. You just keep doing it until you find the right answer. And I remember thinking and coming to the realization, it's not just about iterating, it's about value, in that, yes, I can iterate all day, but if I'm not iterating on the right thing, or if I don't have the right user feedback model in place, which is super, super critical, then I'm not going to know either when I'm done, when I've made the right thing for the user, or when I can pivot and move on to something else, which provide better benefit to maybe different groups of people than the primary voice or a singular customer that I'm focusing on. Ultimately, we're getting to deliver a skateboard, and this is stolen from some of the 18F slides, deliver the skateboard in piecemeal, move up to a bike when it's smart and useful, continue that user feedback so that you ensure happy customers down at the bottom, and we will ultimately get to moving packages at the speed of light, either through the Ethernet and interwebs or with a car in this picture. So those are kind of our key lessons learned from the program management product owner side. I'm happy to take your guys' questions. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, Growl, thanks for that. We have a number of questions that have come in, and I think I'm going to group the first set just around product ownership. I'm going to start with Richard's here, and I may tie in some of the points I'm curious about, which Richard's question, were you fully empowered as the product owner to accept user stories, or did you need to run any past other folks or the chain of command? And my curiosity was just around product ownership and organizational hierarchies can create a lot of friction and conflict from a kind of a culture or process standpoint, and not just in the military. All of government's hierarchical. You have any interesting stories or lessons learned around that as far as your ability to say no?
I'll be honest. So I kind of took on this side job, if you will, when I was I'll say like mid to senior level captain into a major, which is about the mid range of your normal operations officers. And I was answering directly to the senior group commanders at the colonel level, so several intermediary levels in between. And I'll never forget what Colonel Worm Spinelli once threw out to me. He was like, you know what, just whatever you do, take it and run with it. I trust you. Go forth and have a vision, because that's what we're lacking. Ultimately, when I first looked at that, I thought that was daunting, but then I turned it into, well, let's just see where we can go. We were working on a foundation server, TFS, with organizing all of our stories. And ultimately, it just took me a matter of probably like a week or two to just look at our backlog, strip out the things that completely didn't matter. And then I kind of bounced it off a small team of, some of my lead unit reps across the Air Force, and said, hey, if we put these, 5 things in an order, is that going to make sense? And basically no news was good news. And then I just started marching on. I tried to keep the higher leadership in touch with kind of our future roadmap of trying to release quarterly updates, but generally recognized that very few people actually had time to manage or micromanage, if you will, some of the roadmap sort of stuff, and they just wanted to see results. And however they got them, they were accepting of it, and that's where I kind of took it upon myself to just start taking the football and running down the field along with my developers, who were super crafty, super creative, and multidisciplined. Even though we didn't have the right people set up in the right roles, as 18F kind of helped gear us into that with their experiment and iterate phases, and ultimately the path analysis, they just recognized that we had to do something. We'll try and produce something, and something is better than nothing. Does that help, or does that answer?
Absolutely. And one more question that Chris over at NOAA had related to that. Where or how did you learn to be a product owner?
I didn't. Actually, I watched a bunch of YouTube videos sent out by Julia Limpainer with 18F, and ultimately just tried to learn, put myself in the user's shoes, put myself in the developer's shoes, and try and recognize like where I fit in the puzzle, which was very challenging. Ultimately, I'm sure I could have been a lot better with some background in more CPI or some other sort of like lean education. But ultimately, I just tried to think through it from the user stance and try and be that common voice to the developers, which is what they were lacking that entire time, because they were getting questions from 15 different angles, and they needed somebody to boil those down, and previously they didn't have that.
Yeah. Alex has a question. How did this get support and resourced?
Yeah, ultimately, this was supported primarily from the Edwards Air Force Base Ops Group in the test and evaluation or the Developmental Test and Evaluation Group. At Edwards Air Force Base, there's, I'll say, on the order of about 15 squadron level units that all pool their resources in and provide funding and direction for all of the Center Ops On-Line software development. While they're doing that, all the other bases and locations within the Air Force Materiel Command are basically able to take and massage that same product in web form, delivered to different units. Without going too much detail, yeah, essentially it was owned and operated at Edwards, but used throughout the entire CONUS and OCONUS where we do developmental test. And then it was led underneath the ops group commander, which was a colonel level position. And ultimately, we're continuing to try and advocate for a higher level, like MAGCOM level ownership to provide funding, personnel, management support, et cetera.
Great. I'd just like to have a follow-up question with that. Has this gotten any visibility similar to Space Camp or Kobayashi Maru or Kessel Run?
So
starting to point at you as a positive example?
I would say no. We're still in our early days of maturity. We're still struggling with the handoff of some of the duties, responsibilities, and we're still being challenged with kind of a diverse problem set with the the military has a very challenging way of just moving people wherever they want when things are just starting to get going.
Yep.
But yeah, I think we're definitely moving up on the food chain for getting better long-term funding to move ourselves out of the old quote-unquote sustainment only mindset that our previous leadership had basically seen. We took a kind of a funding hit by over half we'll call it about 8 years ago, when they recognized, well, that's about as good as cool we'll ever get, so why bother putting in any more money? And they didn't recognize the need to continually, update, modify, and grow, even though it was continuing to provide a decent bang for the buck in terms of, satisfying all those bases users' needs for, just over $100,000 for a continuously accessible pseudo cloud-based system.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Question from Michael. Did you have to retrain your programmers, or were you able to hire new ones, or both? And I know one of your slides brought up pairing. Was there any pairing with the 18F engineering staff that helped in that, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were dealing with a pretty old code base in that I think it was some old .NET stuff, as well as Java, Visual. I can't remember all the different terms. There was about 5 different languages that the website and the entire software package ran off of, and we basically started moving into the new .NET Core, as well as some C++, and that did take quite a bit of retraining for the programmers, as well as learning the new Azure DevOps online system. And that's where some of the pairing helped quite a bit with Clint and his team at 18F, who's on the call now, as well as we hired in, if you will, 2 more full-time contractors to manage the help desk, as 2 of the contractors moved over to the government civilian side, which was fantastic. And then we hired in, the full-time UI UX, which was trained directly by some of the 18F folks as well. They were very focused on the pipeline, trying to overcome some of the security hurdles that we were basically losing 2 weeks of development time of just passing the branches and the the new developed code through the wickets so that we could release it in a timely manner, rather than having kind of a one button click. Yep, it's deployed. We have a redo or undo option. We didn't really have that just because it was a very high risk perceived environment at the test center. And so in that sense, we were often losing kind of those critical or rapid release capabilities, which ultimately led to frustration, and that's where 18F really helped us grow. Yep.
Excellent. Interesting to hear that. Question here from Steve. Have you seen a shortish video of as-is waterfall SDLC and the to-be Agile describing key differences, benefits?
I do not. I would love to get a link to that one, and maybe it would fix some of my misspeaks or whatnot. But yeah.
And another question here from Aaron. And Aaron, I apologize for not getting to this one sooner. What challenges did you run into from a product ownership perspective with multiple POs and PMs, et cetera, with user stories and providing clarity during refinement and planning?
Yeah, I'll say, well, not only the challenge of getting completely overwhelmed by all the users throwing out all their pain points all at the same time, or having the continuous email backlog of probably 400 complaints and requests, and being able to manage all those with my other full-time job of being a test pilot. I would say we started off kind of in late 2017 timeframe of, well, let's just put 2 product owners at it. And what we learned was that's not gonna work, even though you may have 2 people help grooming the backlog. If you don't have that kind of a singular vision and focus and direction, which is communicated through that backlog, which is on those DevOps boards, then your developers themselves are going to get frustrated, and they're not going to know, who am I answering to who. A perfect example of this is when we were developing some of those scheduling boards and personal schedule modules and calendar pages. I would walk in as the product owner thinking, all right, this is how I want, here are the colors, here's the template, and here's the kind of user flow. And I would try and draw things out on the whiteboard. For them, that's up on their desks, or draw it on a napkin at least and just leave it for them, and leave my cell phone number. And I called that good. And then come to find out, I would have 2 other people walk in with the similar conversation to the same developer, and he would just throw up his hands and call it a day and just sign off and send me an email saying, I tried, I got this, here's where I went. And it would result in, that wasn't what we were looking for. And it was, I had these things in mind for future stuff, and it wouldn't connect. So that was a very simple a challenge that's probably pretty common in the world when you have multiple bosses and multiple feedbacks loop. But it was a hard time getting that initial user outreach model set up, of connecting the base reps or the squadron reps of how do we flow all the requests through to one person who also has an understanding and a responsibility and an ability to basically say no to the users as well. And that's something that we're continuing to try and battle through, because we're dealing with a lot of remotely located organizations, some organizations that have different pieces of the puzzle, or different ways of operating and doing business and interacting with the different resources that are out there, whether it be our flight management software, another maintenance aircraft management online tool that our system has to interface with. So yeah, there's a lot of pieces to that one. And I feel like I could provide a whole nother 5 hours of ranting about some of the challenges, but yeah, no, that's certainly.
Yeah, Growl, it's interesting you bring it up, because especially from a military culture and philosophy standpoint, where Clausewitz lays it out, right? Unity of command and the importance of it coming through one product owner and not multiple stakeholders telling someone what to potentially figure out and do. It's interesting you struggle with that because that happens through much of government. Yeah.
And that was the challenge, especially because this was, I mean, I only had so many hours in the day. I would often find myself working nights and weekends long after, you know, it was bedtime, trying to generate new products, new user guides, new, you know, visual flows of you know, new product pages. And there just wasn't enough time in the day. This was a dedicated job, and we've never staffed or built it smartly, just because we don't have the manpower and we don't have the experience specifically for something exactly like this. However, we have, you know, something nearly adequate, I'll say, and something that is essentially getting the job done now, which is good, of having that operator-based or user-based product owner role as being at least a part-time with empowered developers and an empowered program manager, full-time civilian staff.
Absolutely. One more question here from Rob. Did the team building the new app have to maintain the legacy software concurrently?
Yes. Essentially, because our ops are 24/7, never stopping at, you know, several different locations, they were not only, you know, supporting and maintaining legacy software in the standard 2-week to 4-week sprint cycles of software delivery, but they were prioritizing some of the new stuff, since essentially because we were running off of 10-year-old software and flight ops management tools, the entire community, in a sense, recognized, well, I can't really change my operations because the operations management tools aren't changing, and therefore it was this kind of self-licking ice cream cone of stagnation. That's a crazy simile, but you kind of get the point. Yes, this was a challenging scenario, and looking at where we were back in, you know, 2018 and before, we were taking one team of 5 developers and trying to do all of it, trying to do the old stuff as well as plot out a new path forward. And we were falling on our face continually. You know, our new development would continually break the old stuff and vice versa. And we would ultimately, it felt like we were just trudging in mud. However, with a kind of a clear division of, all right, contracting team, you're going to handle the help desk. You're going to work on the legacy stuff. New team, here's the new vision, go forth and conquer, and try and kind of, you know, separate the so that there was crosstalk when needed. However, the pipelines of the new development didn't blend into the old. And that's where that strangler approach really came into handy, in that when we identified an entire chunk of code was to be released and deployed, that completely took the place. The users would not see kind of the legacy software links or redirects. They would just see, I go from an old page and I enter into the new cool 2.0, if you will, when we started really releasing things on a faster pace.
Growl, this has been a wonderful session. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here and kind of essentially say sorry, not sorry to the audience. This has gone over quite a bit, but when you're getting value, you get value, right? So yep, Alex just shared out. We'd love your feedback. Hit that link, folks, for the survey. Otherwise, Growl, thank you so much for presenting today. If you don't mind, I will probably share this video not just with our community, but I'm going to reach out to Nick and Lauren, U.S. Air Force Chief Software Officer and Transformation Officer, and share your story with them just to expose what's going on there at, with Cool and y'all's success. This is wonderful. Thanks again for your sharing with the community. Sure appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for setting this up, and yeah, happy to continue to answer more questions if you guys have them. yeah, I'm sure we'll be able to figure out a good contact method. Or you could send me an email, taylor.wilson@us.af.mil.
Absolutely. Otherwise, Taylor, feel free to join on Slack, on the DevOps public
Awesome.
Slack. I can email you the way to request access. Folks that want to participate there, I included it in the chat window, so you can feel free to join. Otherwise, on the website, there's also a means of joining the listserv. So, but more and more folks are starting to join the conversation on the public Slack channel too. So, otherwise, thank you so much. You have a wonderful afternoon.
Fantastic. You too. Bye.
Bye.